Okay, folks. Hey, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're calling in from today. We sure do appreciate you being here for LED's webinar series, this month featuring Scott Galvin. So this is Scott's webinar that we'll be seeing momentarily. And what I love about it is that in the lean world, we talk a lot about tools and effectiveness, but the piece that we don't spend near enough time talking about is the idea that people got to buy into the ideas or the tools that we're attempting to use for improvement. So Scott's going to be addressing this very critical issue, frankly, for organizations.
Yeah. Again, my name is Gauvin. Been in operations on strategy and culture consult for almost 30 years now. Started in manufacturing right out of college, a small family-run business, and got to kind of put my fingers into lots of different parts of the business. But the one that I really enjoyed was being on the shop floor, being in the manufacturing environment. But I will admit, I came to lean and kind of some of the traditional ways, much focused on the continuous improvement side of things for probably about the first 15 years. I'll admit I had kind of a lean blind spot when it came to respect for people till about 15 years ago. And I thought I understood it and I thought I was already doing it. I thought I was respecting people until I was engaged in this major transformation. It was a global company. I was working in facilities in France and Germany and Mexico and China. And that's when things started to change for me a little bit. The culture hadn't really affected my previous work because the behaviors that I encountered in the US were so familiar. I really underestimated what I took for granted when it came to how to engage with others from different cultures. And so working globally kind of forced me to pay attention a little bit more to what built trust, what motivated people, and what offended them. Because at the outset of that project, I offended a bunch of people, and that wasn't my intention. And so I realized that, even though I thought I was showing up respectfully, the way people were experiencing me was not the way I had thought that I was showing up. And so this close up view of culture made me approach lean in a very different way than I had up until that point. Up until that point, it was very much about, I had a business case. Let's streamline things. Let's eliminate waste. Let's improve the process. Let's reduce cost. Kind of very traditional. And there a few failures, I started to see some patterns that I realized I needed to pay attention to. And that's kind of what I want to share with you today. So today I'm going to share kind of what I've learned from that experience and culture and how it makes or breaks your lean success and how I started thinking differently about lean is one of the things that I want to cover. Something else is the workplace dynamics and how the dynamics of the workplace shape the outcomes that you're going to get. So I'm going to share a few of the lessons learned from some of my failures, and then talk about how to operationalize the practice of respect for people. One of the things that I think about in continuous improvement, we're always talking about what is the standard for the process. I look at respect for people as kind of the standard for your culture. And then finally, I'm going to share kind of an example of really a profound impact that you can have on performance when it's rolled out systematically and at scale, when you're bringing respect for people kind of to an organization and you're doing it at scale. My hope is that it doesn't take you as long as it took me to learn that though culture is only half of lean, it really carries most of the weight. And so that's what I want to dig into. But first, I want to make this a little bit more interactive. So if you've got your chat window ready, I'm going to ask you a question here and just want to get some feedback from you. So I wanted to start with first your perspective. Why does lean so often fall short? Why does it fail? We hear there's lots of reasons why our lean efforts don't work, but what are some of the ones that you've experienced? What are some of the reasons why maybe it didn't give you the results that you wanted? Let's see, a bunch of leaderships here, leadership, management buy-in. Wow, a lot of management and leadership stuff. No continuity, up, a lack of sustainable mechanisms, the resources, some more leadership, not getting the buy-in. Yeah, people maybe had an experience. They feel like their voice isn't going to be heard. It's like, we're doing this again, really. Working in silos, yeah, we see that a lot. Lean way is always the path of least resistance. Not aligned with all the stakeholders, competing priorities. Yeah, wow, a lot of really good ones. And of course, change is hard. Different philosophies, all great ones. So what I want to do is kind of dig in a little bit here. Those are all really good ones. So we'll come back to your responses in a minute. But I believe that the answer to why lean fails kind of lies in how we think about and approach it. And this was really the big lesson for me. So I want to start by taking a look at kind of what I've learned about how culture makes or breaks lean success. And so this was kind of the beginning of my personal transformation about thinking about this. And so for a lot of organizations, lean is driven by the elimination of something. Often, we're focusing on some kind of waste in the pursuit of efficiency or cost reduction. And so what do? We go all in on the continuous improvement, bring all the tools, and CI can have a huge impact, of course. All of our efforts then are focused on the resources that go into engaging in Kaizen around processes that we want to improve, and that we want to try to gain more efficiencies in reducing cost or some of that waste. And so we go all in on continuous improvement. Except that lean is more than continuous improvement. It's really, if you think about the Toyota production system, they call it a system. It's because lean is based on that, right? Lean is a system based on that Toyota way, but it's powered not only by continuous improvement, but it's also powered by people. And despite a model that very clearly points out that culture is half of the equation, it still took me 15 years to stop focusing on just CI like it was the whole game, and to really figure out how to integrate respect for people elements with the continuous improvement elements. And that's kind of what I want to walk through. One of the things that really, along with my global transformation experience, one of the things that really kind of hit home for me is I was rethinking things and going back and rereading and looking at, why is Toyota having so much success? What am I struggling so much? And I came across this quote from Fujio Cho. First, we build people, then we build cars. First, we build people. And I started asking myself, okay, what am I doing first? Am I building people first? Training is not building people. Let's just be clear on that. Training is not building people. First, we build people. And I started thinking, no, what am I doing first? First, I'm trying to improve the process. And at the time, my understanding of driving performance, even my understanding of Toyota's success, was completely different. I looked at it from, they've got all these great processes, and that wasn't really the crux of their success. The crux of their success was first they built people. And so let me ask you, what percentage of lean transformations fail? So we've heard, we got some reasons why. And the first question, I want to kind of benchmark, what do you think that percentage is? What percentage of efforts fail? Okay, I got 85, 80%. Yeah, 80 again, 90%. Okay, 70. Yeah, so we're hovering somewhere between 70 to 90%. And that is pretty common what I have experienced and what I've seen and what I've heard and what I've been around when we're talking to other people who are trying to bring lean into organizations. Those numbers seem to fall in line pretty accurately, between 70 and 90%. So by revisiting the literature and reflecting on my experience, I realized that my struggle to implement and sustain lean wasn't because I didn't know what needed to change or how to apply the tools. I knew how to do that pretty well. It was my interventions didn't address the human side of that lean system. Most of my efforts didn't think about the human elements. And so, I kind of minimized those human elements. And so when we talk about it, we say, it's all about people. I hear that a lot. It's all about people. People first. We even have other methods like servant leadership. But in practice, we still tend to focus and put most of our time and energy on process. And in my view, that's exactly why most lean transformations fail. I think that's really the crux of it. Many of the reasons that you mentioned in the chat tells me that you know this as well. You listed out a bunch of reasons why things fail. And all of these factors kind of relate to culture. And these are just some of the ones that are common that I hear: lack of leadership, resistance to change, focus on tools, insufficient employee engagement, failure to align the lean efforts with strategy and purpose, and no plan for sustaining. All of those in your comments. And so if you look at all of those, though, they all come back to culture. And that was an epiphany moment for me. And so with that, I realized, there's something different I've got to do here. And so I want to transition now to talking about the dynamics of the workplace and how culture shapes the outcomes that we're actually going for. So if we know this already and respect for people is so important, why is more widely practiced? And so that was a question that I went down this rabbit hole to try to answer, and did a lot of research, so almost 6 years of research trying to answer that question. And, there's no clear answer to it, but I did come away with a couple of things. One, that there's really not a clear breakdown of how to operationalize it. We have lots of information, thousands of books on the continuous improvement side of things, very little on the respect for people side of things. So we try to solve it with one-off trainings or some maybe arbitrary skill building. So that's one problem that I see. The second is that we confuse individual acts of respect with organizational practice of respect for people. And then we think that because we're not jerks, that we're kind of already doing check. Respecting people is different than the practice of respect for people. And in fact, I made a post on LinkedIn just yesterday highlighting exactly this. But respecting people is an individual action. It's based on my personal value system. It's how I react to someone in that moment of exchange. Whereas respect for people is how we are proactively designing respect into our processes, into our systems, into our policies, into the cultural fabric of the organization. It is something that is universal, not something that is for leaders only to do. Like if you read most of the lean books, they talk about what leaders should do for employees. That's not what respect for people is. It's a universal practice. Everyone, 100% of the people in the organization need to be on board, and the standards are laid out so that we can all practice. We all have a common lexicon. We all have a common practice that we're engaging in. And so it's proactive, it's universal, and it's something that is sustained beyond who the leader is in the organization. So anyway, that's a little side note on the difference between respecting people and respect for people. But the third thing that I saw was that culture is fuzzy. When you start talking about culture, you're like, oh, okay. And, and it's hard to lead. It's hard to measure. It's time consuming to change. And then we think that culture is HR's job, and we don't see it as our own role in shaping. And so respect for people looks at culture as it's a universal obligation for everyone in the organization. Just HR's job. It's everyone's. So those were a few things. As Edward Deming said, every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And so if you're thinking of lean as a system, and your system is getting the results that it's designed to get, well, then maybe there's something missing in the system if you're not getting the results that you want. And so we usually apply that thinking to our production systems or our processes or our value streams, but it also applies just as powerfully to culture. Culture is, again, everyone's job because it's the context in which we make decisions, the way we perceive and solve problems, how we determine what and who is valued in the organization, and when and how people can actually use maybe the CI tools that they're taught. Culture is a system too. And like any system, it produces predictable outcomes, often without us even realizing it. For better or worse, it shapes how work gets done. So I'm going to ask you one more question here that you can respond to. And this one, I'm going to show you a picture, and I want you to just give me your visceral response. Don't think about it. Don't try to analyze it. Just what's the first word or words that come to mind when you see this image? Okay, here we go. So get ready to drop it into your chat. First word that comes to mind, your visceral response about the person who painted this white line on the road. What's the first response? They're lazy, okay. Deviation, oops, lazy, swerve, not my job, lazy, doesn't care, reactive, government worker, yeah. Seriously, yeah, lazy, no respect, not my job, yeah. All very typical. And so the most common word that we hear is lazy. And so, okay, well, how do we fix a lazy problem? Well, before we figure that out, let me give you a little bit of background. What if I told you that prior to that incident, John, the worker that painted that line, was considered a high performer, and that morning his boss basically gave him an ultimatum, said, hey, I need you to hit your mileage quota, or you're probably going to be looking for a new job. But that context, you might see that white line a little differently. As John's story demonstrates, to understand why this happened and to fix it, it's not enough to just look at how the line was painted or how the worker was trained or how he should be disciplined or what the standard work looked like. You have to look at the cultural conditions that kind of led to its painting. Whether you agree with the way he solved that problem or not, it's one of the things that we say is that all behavior is an expression of an unmet need. His unmet need was, I can't lose my job. I will get those miles today. Whether he solved it in the right way or not, he did exactly what he was told to do. And so what we've got to look at is what behaviors impacted how his work got done. If I'm trying to solve for a lazy problem, well, easy. Fire John and get someone who's not lazy. But that's not going to actually fix the root of that problem. We're still going to have a measurement problem issue, and it's probably going to pop up in a different way down the road. So that's one of the things that we started to realize around what is the power of practicing respect for people. The other thing that we noted is that the ways employees interact and how work gets done reflects the cultural norms at play and reinforces them. So there's a feedback loop between individual behavior and organizational culture. And you know this, if you've been in any organization where there were some negative behaviors by individuals, that affected the team or the group or the department later. And so social learning theory suggests that people learn behaviors, values, the norms by observing others. And in the workplace, employees take their cues from leaders, they take it from peers, they gradually adopt the behaviors they see modeled, which shapes the culture. Interesting thing about this is if you've got a negative culture, it's going to stem from those individual behaviors. What happens is an individual behavior gets dropped into that bidirectional feedback loop. It affects the culture. That culture then affects another individual. And so you've got this never-ending kind of bidirectional feedback loop. The antidote to that is to embed positive behaviors into that same cycle. When you do that, it has the same effect. A positive individual behavior will affect the culture, which will then affect another individual, which will inspire them to drop in another positive behavior. And so with this understanding, we understand how we can affect culture. We've got to have more positive inputs into that bidirectional feedback than we have negative ones. And so we've got to design that. We've got to be intentional about that. We've got to be specific about that. We've got to have a standard of what are those inputs that we're putting into that bidirectional feedback loop. Okay, so with that, what is respect for people? Well, as I started to, over that 6 years of really doing the research, I started to really say, what is respect for people? What really is respect for people? I went on this quest to really understand it and interviewed hundreds of people from Toyota specifically. And so I realized when I was facing resistance, when I was getting that misalignment and I was getting low engagement, I started to wonder if the problem wasn't the tools themselves, but maybe it was the environment that were being used in the wrong way. My efforts to kind of decode what respect for people led me to thinking about really Toyota's environment, about their environment. Is it different than what I'm seeing in other places? And what Toyota employees did especially well were three things that I noticed. So there were three observations I had. First, they saw behaviors more objectively. They didn't judge what they were seeing. They wouldn't have judged that white line because lazy is an assumption. It's a judgment about that person's character. So Toyota wouldn't do that. They would have looked at that and been more objective about that. The second is that they value the entirety of a person's experience. And this was exemplified many times by lots of different stories. But one story was Maria. I asked, why was Maria on this team? And Maria said, oh, well, they told me, well, Maria's on this team because she's traveled to lots of different countries. So she just has a very different perspective than us. I said, okay. What about Mike? Mike has nothing to do with this department or this process. Oh, well, Mike has raised 5 boys. And I started thinking, well, what does raising 5 boys have to do with solving this problem? But what they were saying is we value that people have these other experiences, this other knowledge, these other skills outside of the role or position, the specific trade that they are bringing to the job. And so they value the entirety of a person's experience. And then the third thing that I observed was that they were really good about connecting to this, what we call the collective wisdom. Not only were they good about bringing together this kind of diverse group of people, but they were really good about doing it for mutual benefit. It couldn't just be so that it was the right solution for the customer or the right solution for the person leading the change group. It had to be mutually beneficial for all of the stakeholders. And they pained over doing that. I realized that these were the cultural conditions that I saw missing or lacking in many of the organizations that not only struggle to make continuous improvements, but that also were struggling with performance and sustainability and other cultural issues. So applying these insights to the companies that I was working with, I saw that they were often doing almost the opposite of these things. They were not objective, but reactive. They were often jumping to action without really having enough context or really understanding of what created that white line. They value the technical skills and status versus the overall experience of that person. The third thing was that they often turned to the usual suspects for answers instead of really actively seeking diverse perspectives for mutual benefit. They went to it was a quality issue, call the quality guys. They'll fix it. And so I started thinking, well, what if we could teach teams and organizations to think and behave according to those three things? Would that make a huge difference? And so that kind of sent us down this path of saying, okay, well, let's maybe decode and define what this looks like. The engineer in me couldn't help myself. I tried to reverse engineer what I was seeing and what I was learning. And I started to pair that with the hallmarks of what I was learning about the Toyota culture and some of the other cultures that I thought had a good practice of respect for people. That helped me identify the conditions I thought organizations needed to create if they wanted to improve employee satisfaction, engagement, and performance. And for me, improving how the organization functions as a whole starts with improving how everyone thinks, especially coworkers think, and relate to one another as individuals. When those everyday interactions shift, the culture starts to shift. When you have those positive inputs into that bidirectional feedback loop, that's what creates the lasting change because it's really affecting the culture as well. That insight led me to define 3 core cultural conditions I now use to help build organizations. And so I took the seeing behaviors more objectively and I said, okay, well, what do we call that? So we started calling that engaging with compassion. Then I took the value in the entirety of a person's experience. We started calling that treating people like they matter. And then I took the lessons we learned from connecting to that collective wisdom. And we started calling that partnering with mutual benefit. And so together, these are what I call the principles of the respect for people mindset. It's a mindset that brought to life the specific behaviors, the observable behaviors that we wanted to teach people. And that's what I want to share with you today. And so this framework first starts with how individuals perceive and respond to the most common aspect of work, the people and technical problems. So, everyday organizations want their people to better see and solve problems, but solving the right problem in the right way requires this big picture thinking, not just jumping to conclusions or reacting from habit to those white lines, asking ourselves, what are the behaviors that support that objective thinking? What does it take to shift the way someone frames a problem? And that led us to looking at 3 kind of core behaviors that if people engaged in those behaviors, then it would help them see behaviors more objectively. And so we call that engaging with compassion. So the 3 behaviors were first, checking your perspective, slowing down to examine your assumptions. Are you seeing the full picture or are you just maybe seeing a slice of it? The second thing is seeking to understand, really staying curious, asking questions, listening for the context and trying to see the situation really from the other person's perspective. We talk about going to the Gemba. This is really at the heart of going to the Gemba. And the third one, which was a revelation for me, was what we call acting to support. So instead of fixing for the sake of fixing or acting in ways that are like, oh, hey, we've just got to solve this problem, we wanted to act in ways that truly helped others move forward. And so it was about supporting the person who is dealing with that problem in their best interest, not in the best interest of the CI team, not in the best interest of the manager, not in the best interest of the end customer, but in the best interest of the person who is actually engaged in dealing with that problem. That was a new way of thinking because, I just want to go in, I want to help fix it. But maybe they didn't need me to fix it. They just needed to think through the problem because they wanted to do it on their own. And so that caused me to kind of reflect on how I was even showing up with people. And so, together these behaviors add up to what we call engaging with compassion. They kind of remind us to look beyond the surface appearances or what seem like maybe obvious behaviors, those, that went behind, to really consider the context of people's actions. And so the goal of engaging with compassion is to move from being reactive to reflective in our problem solving. And so engaging with compassion is really the beginning of problem solving. It's the foundation of problem solving. It's what we see missing in a lot of problem solving exercises. By learning to recognize and diffuse judgment, that skews, our decision making and constrain our team dynamics. And so That was kind of the first foundational piece. We then saw the next thing that we looked at was after addressing how people frame problems, we turned our attention to how people perceive their coworkers. And I saw someone drop in there, treat people the way you want to be treated. And that's a little bit of this. It's easy to assume that competence is tied to someone's status, title, or their role. But when we do that, we risk overlooking the value of lived experience. And personal strengths might overlook their non-technical abilities, especially from those in maybe less visible positions. This way of thinking not only really discounts people's contributions and limits collaboration, it really kind of diminishes potential. And so thinking about how to help people more fully see and value the people they work with led us to these 3 key behaviors, which we ultimately call treat people like they matter. So the first one was prioritizing well-being. And it's really recognizing that people do their best work when physical, emotional, psychological needs are all supported. When your physical, emotional, and psychological needs are supported, it allows you to show up better. The second was valuing individuality. This one, a lot of debate around this one. But what I realize is that if we appreciate the unique mix of strengths and experiences and viewpoints each person brings, we're then going to tap into those people around us that can offer a different way of thinking or maybe even support in a different way than we sometimes realize. And then the third one was about spotlighting others. And everyone kind of gets their feathers ruffled a little bit about this one because the first thing they say is, well, not everybody wants to be highlighted in front of everyone. That's not what this is. This can be done in a very personal, private way, but it's about appreciating and showing gratitude for who people are, not just what they do, not just the performative recognition. It's about recognizing the personal qualities, contributions, the everyday actions that make a difference, especially the ones that often go unnoted. Just with a little personal note, it's really about thinking about how to better see and value the entirety of a person's experience led us to these things. And so these affirming behaviors really translate into, again, what we call treating people like they matter. They enable us to more clearly see and call on the talent, the expertise that our coworkers have. Not just leaders doing this, but everybody doing this. And so the goal of treating people like they matter is to really move from isolation of indifference and the stress of feeling like you have to solve everything on your own to more inclusive interactions where we reach out to connect with the expertise around us, with the people around us. And so this principle is about recalibrating our perceptions of who and what is valuable and who is qualified to solve problems so that people can feel more comfortable and prepared to really effectively collaborate. That brings us to the other constant at work, which is collaboration. And so the way we communicate, what we share, and how open we are to new perspectives not only impacts our individual efforts, it also influences our collective success. The way we support teammates, the way we engage with our teammates, and whether or not we ever get to that new idea. So as I was starting to think about the skills to be able to collaborate with people beyond the usual suspects led us to 3 other behaviors that we thought were critical. The first one we call showing your cards, and that's really just about being open about your intentions, your challenges, the goals that you have. And this is really kind of the foundation of building trust and transparency. And so there's a whole skill, it turns out, in being able to do that. The second one was then that allows us to then speak with candor. And so it allows us to communicate directly and considerately, even when it's uncomfortable, so people can take real action. The problem with candor is everyone thinks, oh, I can be candid, and that they think it's just saying what's on your mind. That is being rude. Candor is really a balance between being direct, but doing it with care for the other individual. If you're missing that care element, you're just being rude in many cases. And then the third one is about getting on the same page. It's really prioritizing dialogue over debate. Debate is, kind of a win-lose. Dialogue is, hey, let's get the conversation out on the table so that we can then share what we know. And that creates a shared understanding. It creates more alignment. It creates more commitment. If you want people to get on the same page, you've got to get them to commit. In order to get them to commit, they got to buy in. Well, in order to buy in, they've got to be able to weigh in. And so the whole model kind of builds on itself. In order for people to weigh in so that they can get to getting on the same page, they need to be able to speak candidly. Well, you're only going to speak candidly if you can show your cards. And you're going to be more likely to share your cards if people are spotlighting you and appreciating you. And you're going to spotlight and appreciate someone because you value who they are as an individual And you're going to value who they are because you're prioritizing not only your own well-being, but their well-being. And you want to prioritize their well-being because you're trying to support them. You're trying to act to support them. And you're supporting them because you understand what's going on. You understand the context around them. And you can understand the context around them because you haven't judged them. You've suspended your judgment, checking your perspective about them. So the whole model kind of builds on itself. And so together, these partner for mutual benefit behaviors is how teams really work their way up to innovation. The goal of partnering for mutual benefit is to move from conflict to collaboration. And we do this by moving from kind of that transactional tit for tat interaction to really a partner mindset that sees collaboration as an opportunity to co-create for really everyone's benefit versus competing for resources or competing for recognition or competing for that next maybe promotion. And so thinking about how to help organizations scale the principles and behaviors with respect to people is what led us to create kind of this roadmap idea. And so our goal was simple: provide an actual scalable solution to lean transformation's most common pitfall, which is culture. And so we've been doing this for a couple of years now. And what we have consistently seen is when we bring organizations and the people in those organizations through kind of this model and teach them those behaviors, teach them those skills, that culture isn't just improved, but really performance is amplified. And before I take questions here, I can give you a quick little case study on what happened with this sheet metal fabricator. They were struggling with what they thought were really productivity issues, but the real challenge was how people were working together. They were facing a lot of the common problems. They were a technically strong organization, but collaboration hadn't really evolved kind of at the same pace as their technology. And so they had siloed culture departments. There were a lot of departmental barriers that made it hard to solve problems across the functions. Problems got passed between departments. So, the issues got basically kicked down the line instead of resolved at the source. HR was fielding a lot of interpersonal conflict, more than it was all about individual performance issues that they were really trying to address. A lot of firefighting as it was diverting leaders from really focusing on growth. And they just kept trying to introduce lean. It just wasn't sticking. And part of it was because they were introducing the continuous improvement side of lean. They really weren't doing the people side of lean. So I kind of realized that no amount of optimization would work if they weren't doing something about the people, if they weren't trying to address some of the people and culture issues. So culture was really the bottleneck. So they decided to start their journey with the half of lean that they had never really considered before. And instead of throwing more process at the problem, they did what a lot of companies don't, and they went all in on culture, putting the entire company through kind of this learning around what respect for people is and practicing and learning the skills of respect for people. A few months into rolling out the roadmap, the workplace dynamics started to shift a little bit. More people were thinking about the upstream and downstream implications of their work. Issues were no longer viewed in isolation, but as part of the larger system. The COO said that people told him they were communicating better, not only with their colleagues, but with their spouses, with their families, with their neighbors. And that he said that he was seeing changes in people that you normally only attribute to major life events, something he wasn't really expecting from the workforce and the work that we were doing. Only about 8 months into the work that we were doing to teach everyone how to practice respect for people, the organization was seeing about a 20-30% increase in output. That's before we were doing any of the CI tools. There was no software. There was really no CI tools being implemented at this point, but it was just from better collaboration, proactive problem solving. It was just less conflict. Employees were starting to lead their own kind of makeshift daily stand-ups. We would call it a daily stand-up, but they were just getting together more kind of organically, keeping the teams just more aligned and resolving issues before it escalated. And really, the efficiency has significantly improved as problems are increasingly being solved at the source. And there's almost an organic culture of now continuous improvement that's starting to emerge from that organization. So really doing a case study for going all in on the practice of respect for people. So with that, I think I still have a little time, right, Manny, to take some questions. And so would be happy to take a few questions about the research, the model, or even the case study.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I think we've got about another 17 minutes left or so.
Okay. Yeah, I can see you.
Okay. Oh, good. Because I can't see myself. It's weird. Sometimes my camera seems to go in and out. Anyway, you've got some stuff coming through in the chat.
Yeah. So one question, what would you say is a great first step to integrate this theory in a corporation? So the first step would be to get a pilot group of 15 to 20 people together to learn the principles and the behaviors and to get some proficiency with those, because you need a small foundation of people. And it's nice if it's cross-functional. So not just all the leaders, but a cross-functional group, so that that group can then come together and say, okay, hey, we're learning these things. What are the roadblocks? Now you can start to have a conversation around what potential roadblocks that we're going to see if we start to roll these out, so that you can start to design around that before you start to bring this across the whole enterprise. And a lot of people will ask me, hey, do we have to start with leaders, or do we start from, you can almost start anywhere. Because it's, if I go back to that bi-directional feedback loop, let me see if I can back up there real quick. If you go back to this bi-directional feedback loop, it almost doesn't matter where you start. You got to start dropping in these positive behaviors so that you can then start to affect the culture. So it doesn't matter where you start. You need at least a coalition or a small group of people. Ideally, your rollout will be at least 10% of the population. What we see is, once you've got about 10% of the population dropping in these positive behaviors into the culture, you start to see movement. And there's a whole system that we kind of designed around this, around the psychology of social proofing. Social proofing is just when you're seeing things from other people and you're starting to adopt those behaviors. And so 10% seems to be kind of the benchmark of, that's the minimum that you need in order to start that social proofing to kick in. So kind of lost track of the questions here, Manny. What's the next one?
Okay, so there's a number of them actually. There's one that asks, are there any tips you can share to help with multi-generational workforces and the issue of tribal knowledge?
Yeah. So tribal knowledge is just when you don't have really good standard work. That's kind of the point of standard work, right? Collect all that knowledge. Let's get it documented so that we can then start to share it. The reason people don't share that knowledge is mostly out of fear. And so that's telling you something about the environment. If people aren't willing to share it, that's giving you good insight into, there's just not the psychological safety there. And we talk about psychological safety, but in order to have psychological safety, you have to have trust. And in order to have trust, you have to have a foundation of respect. So really, respect builds trust, trust builds psychological safety. So there's a path there. So that's the tribal knowledge piece. The multi-generational piece is, we all kind of have our ways of showing up. And one of the things that we really started to focus on, because Toyota just does this so well, is they have 3 or 4 generations represented in their plants. So how do they all get along? Well, they've got this standard work of how to engage. They've got the standard work of, what does it mean to engage with someone, to communicate with someone, to deal with conflict with someone. And when you've got that kind of standard work, it makes that intergenerational piece a lot easier, because, man, even between you and I, we're going to deal with conflict in different ways, even if we're in the same generation. But now when you go across generations, that gets more diverse. And so, but if we're able to engage with each other in a respectful way, you can bridge those divides a lot easier. But when you don't have that respect standard, that's where we start to see a lot of that conflict pop up.
With your interviews of Toyota reps, is there a difference between the US and Japan in developing culture?
Yes. Well, that could be a whole podcast in itself. So, so in Japan, they've got some advantages that we don't have here. Their culture, just their culture in general, the Japanese culture, has some elements of respect for people that are kind of automatically embedded in just the way people are brought up. And so it's easier in Japan than it is in the US. So we have to be a little bit more intentional. We have to be a little bit more systematic. We have to be a little bit more in the design of what is the kind of culture, because some of the elements that make TPS work are not innate in our culture here in the US. And so this idea of respect for people, without getting too much of the history, I mean, Taiichi Ono and Sakichi Toyota were students of Confucianism. And so innate in them are a couple of the philosophies. So one philosophy that Confucian thinking kind of brings to the forefront is that everyone is good and that everyone wants to do good. And so you approach someone from that perspective. And that's not how we necessarily approach people from, the kind of American culture perspective. The second is that Confucian thinking says that everyone is infinitely provable and upgradable. And so just thinking about people, like, you are infinitely provable and upgradable. And it is our obligation to help you be as much as you can be. And that's just kind of innate in that part of the culture. And we don't think that way. It's a little bit more doggy dog in kind of the American workplace. We don't think about it as our responsibility to help someone achieve and get better than where they are. We don't look at that as part of when we're sitting next to us, we don't think about it as it's my responsibility to make sure that he's getting better. And he's thinking, well, it's my responsibility to make sure that Scott's getting better. We just don't have that foundational mindset. So some of that has to be designed in. And that's kind of what the whole premise behind Respect for People is kind of evolved around.
There's a couple of questions about leadership, and I think it's related to the role they play, what happens when there's a disconnect with leadership, and how can somebody who is not in a leadership position start to drive this in their organization? And maybe several questions, actually.
I'm not sure what the first question is around. Are you saying you need leadership support to do this? Is that the question?
Well, the original question was, what's the role of leadership in all this? And how can they not just support it, but help drive this new behavior and way of living?
Yeah. Well, let me share with you some of what we've learned about changing culture and leadership. What we learned was that the way we traditionally try to change culture is that we take the leaders offsite for a 2, 3, 4, 5 day lecture style kind of training. They get all this, what we call education. They get all this knowledge. And then they have to go back to the business and they have to internalize and contextualize that. They then have to figure out what are those new behaviors that they need to model. And then how do they cascade that into the organization? That is a big ask of leaders who are very busy. First of all, they're only going to remember 5% of what they heard. And so if they've internalized it, which is a big if, because we see more than 70% of the leaders don't really contextualize and internalize it. If they've then figured out, here are the key behaviors that we need to engage in. If they've done that, that's another big if. Then what they do is they take the next tier of managers and they share the 5% that they remembered. And then those leaders then have to take that 5%. They may remember 5% of that 5%. They have to internalize it. They then have to develop the behaviors that they want to share. And that continues to cascade. So you can imagine it just continues to erode rapidly. That is why we don't see culture change happening when you do it from the top down. What we realized is that we do it too fast. We give them too much information too quickly, and that it has to be a universal thing that's happening across the organization. So it doesn't matter whether you're a leader or a frontline employee. The information that you're sharing has to be universal, and it has to allow people to not only take in the information, but to then contextualize it and to then share with them the behaviors and then give them a chance to practice those behaviors more collectively. So that's kind of how we think about culture change in a different way. Going back to, yes, it's helpful if you've got leadership support, but really it's about going where you can get engagement and creating that engagement, because as people start to behave in these ways, as you're starting to teach, so it could happen in the middle of the organization, could happen at the top of the organization, but you've got to have somebody in the organization who is saying, hey, I want to bring our team, I want to bring our department, I want to bring our group through kind of this learning, and I want us to start behaving in a different way. And when that happens, I mentioned social proofing earlier, and it contributes to this bidirectional feedback that I have up on the screen here. And what happens is when you've got that change happening in a small group, you get that social proofing. Social proofing is simply just, the example I would give is, let's say you're walking down the street, there's 5 people in front of you. The very first person gives a homeless person some money. You see that, you're 5% likely to follow that behavior. But then the second person does it. Well, now you're like 50% likely. The third person does it. By the time the fifth person does it, you're like 90% likely to follow that behavior. So what we've got to do is design what those behaviors are going to be, have a standard, and then everybody in that small group, that's why I said 20 people, doing that, because now there's social proof of, hey, these are the new behaviors that we want to engage in. And then you invite people outside of that and you start to make connections outside and inviting them in to say, hey, I want to share with you what we're learning. And then you start to kind of grow it. So you can grow it from the middle out. If you can get the leaders to say, hey, we want to endorse this and bring it throughout the whole organization, that is phenomenal. Very few organizations do that. It usually starts more organically with a small team, a small group, a small department, a small division, and it just starts to grow from there. And the change is noticed. It's dramatic for some of these organizations. You will see if your department's doing it, other departments are going to be like, what are you guys doing? People are going to notice, and they're going to start asking about it. So I think you can start anywhere is, I guess, the short answer there.
Yeah. So Frank was asking a question, what's the role of leaders in the model? Part of what I'm hearing is that it's modeling the behavior. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking that even in small groups, not just modeling, but calling it out. Like, for instance, if my vice president says one thing, but my manager does something else, then,
Yeah.
you sort of defer to the senior leader in the room.
Yeah. I'll give you a very specific example of how this shows up. So say you're in a meeting, it's a mixed group of people. There's a leader there. There's some engineers, there's some frontline people, whatever it is, right? You're in a meeting and someone starts saying, oh, well, it's because X, Y, and Z. And one of the very first things we teach is how do you check your perspective? Well, we got this model called tabs. Is what you're saying and thinking actually true? Do you have facts to support that? A, have you considered an alternative explanation as to what you're describing or what you think you're seeing? Like the line in the row, he's lazy. Is there other alternative explanations as to why maybe he did that other than lazy? Third is B, have you considered the big picture? Like what is the larger context around why that white line was created? If you say no to any one of those three, then you have to move to suspending judgment. And what we see in a meeting is someone says, oh, hey, hold on, guys, I think we need to check our tabs. It's a phenomenal use of the tools. And then everyone says, oh, okay, yeah. And they know what that means. And so there's this common lexicon, this common vernacular that they can put into practice. And so everyone in that meeting says, oh, yeah, are we making a judgment here? Are we making an assumption here? And let's challenge those judgments and assumptions so that we can move forward. And that can shift the conversation very dramatically. So yes, it's not only calling out the behaviors, it is demonstrating them in everyday interactions. And the more leaders can do that, the more others will adopt that.
I think that people definitely take their cues from their leaders. And the way I think about it, Scott, too, people look at what leaders spend their time on and determine that that's what's important. So if leaders say we want culture, but we're not willing to put time into it, and that's telling everybody what's important in the organization.
I mean, I think that's a huge point is that, we get a lot of organizations that come to, they say, well, how long is this going to take? This is not an insignificant thing to take on. It requires a fair amount of commitment. It can be a little bit time consuming. And then they're like, well, we can't carve out that much time. What are you saying? It's not worth our time to set a standard for our culture, to improve our culture so that we can improve the way we engage, so we can improve the way we communicate, so that we can improve the way we exchange and collaborate and work with each other. But you get what you get and you can't get upset. If you're not willing to invest the time, then yeah, you got to deal with what you got at the end of the day.
And it's interesting too. Somebody put up a link to the leadership from a dancing guy. I've seen this video on YouTube before, and it's about first followers and sort of the tipping point. Take a look at the video.
That's a perfect example of social proofing. And so, the more people that kind of engaged, the more it was okay for more to do that. I might even have to incorporate that in somewhere because that's a perfect example of what we're trying to do. We're saying, hey, we need a few dancing guys who can then set the example so that you can then invite more people to come dance together.
So your time is precious and you can spend it a lot of ways. We appreciate you spending the last hour or so with us.